Hello and welcome to Dragon and Elephant India, China in Focus. Today we're looking at what many call the India China dance, a relationship defined by both deep interdependence and sharp rivalry. So, on the one hand, you have trade between India and China that hit a staggering $127.8 billion last year. Now, here's the rub. India imported over 113 billion US dollars worth of goods, but exported only about $14 billion worth of goods, leaving us with a staggering trade deficit of $99.2 billion. And then, on the other hand, there's also the line of actual control. Over 100,000 troops remain deployed on both sides since the deadly Galwan clash of 2020. Meanwhile, China's defense spending in 2024 was estimated to be 314 billion US dollars, nearly four times India's 86 billion, raising questions about how this power imbalance plays out on the ground. We also saw Prime Minister Modi travel to China for the first time in 7 years, although he has met with President Xi on other occasions. But this was his first visit in 7 years to China. And he was welcomed with open arms. He was treated with a lot of respect and given a pride of place at the SCO summit. In fact, he had a bilateral with President Xi, and things seem to be thawing. But there's also that other sentiment that can we trust China? Do we need to trust China in order to have a workable relationship with them when it comes to trade? So we need to make sense of this very unusual and complicated situation. And I couldn't think of a better person to call to discuss this with us. And that's journalist and China watcher, Sreemoy Talukdar. Hi, Sreemoy. Thank you for joining us.
Advaita, thanks for having me here.
So here we are sitting and watching the visuals of China from China, and they were good. I mean, the prime minister was treated very well. He held his ground. It signaled to the world that India is a major player on the global stage, a huge departure from what we were about 11 years ago. And credit for that really does go to Prime Minister Modi. But China, if this was Facebook, we'd call the relationship complicated. So tell me how you're viewing it, because you track these things very closely. I'm speaking from the perspective of the public.
Prime Minister Modi went to China for the first time in 7 years. That should tell us something. In my latest piece, I have described this as a cautious re engagement. I do not consider this as a reset of any sort. But it's important to understand the perspectives from where both India and China, one of the two largest countries in the world, are coming from. There is a perception in the West that Trump's bad behavior and his tariffs have pushed India into the arms of the Chinese. This is the line being pushed by the Western commentators. Some of it is, I think, absolute nonsense. India is not going to fall into Chinese arms. That's not a possibility. We are in a tactical thaw with the Chinese, but this thaw did not start with whatever has been happening in Washington D.C. In fact, this rapprochement started, I would say, last year after the Kazan summit, on the sidelines of it, when Prime Minister Modi met President Xi Jinping, and there was an understanding that there will be
President Xi.
some sort of
Yeah.
disengagement. Yes. So from there, I think there's a very interesting article which came out in the Indian Express. It said that from there, the Indian and Chinese officials have been meeting on and off almost every week, leading to this bilateral summit, which we saw on the sidelines of SCO. So this happened independently of what was happening in Washington D.C. So the fact that Prime Minister Modi went to
Okay,
SCO
so
to meet President Xi Jinping should not be taken as India cocking a snook at Washington D.C. and saying that, look, we are now going to the Chinese arms. That is not what is happening here. But That said, I will now come to what exactly was the signaling. So there, obviously, these players, US, China, and India, they're all doing signalings in their own way. Let's take the Chinese first. What was Xi Jinping's plan on when he almost laid down the red carpet for Prime Minister Modi? What was he trying to get out of it? If you notice, for the very first time, the Chinese arranged for a bilateral meeting between Chai Shi, who's actually a very powerful man in China, who's called the right hand man of President Xi Jinping, and also a very powerful man. He's a member of the Politburo Standing Committee and a very powerful man in his own right. This is a man whom Xi trusts completely, and
His right
he
hand, they say.
Yes, this is a man whom she trusts completely, and this is a man whom many people fear for his proximity to Xi Jinping within the Chinese Communist Party. So, why was this man allowed a meeting with with Prime Minister Modi? This was a definite signaling from China. It was trying to tell India that the fact that you are standing up to the US, we recognize this, and we appreciate this. This sort of a message was also reinforced by the Chinese state media. If you notice, Global Times and other Chinese media outlets, they came out with a string of editorials praising India, that India is standing up to American bullying. And in fact, you must have noticed that Chinese ambassador in India, he was in a program. He actually said the fact that China is backing India, and it is whatever Donald Trump is doing is wrong. So quite clearly, China wanted to show to India that we want you to be more independent of the US. And this has been China's line for a very long time. The Chinese have a major problem with India. They think that India is in collusion with the United States in order to contain the Chinese. And this is something China doesn't want, which is why China is encouraging more of this kind of behavior from India, that you go against the US and then we can do business a little bit more. So this was one of the signalings which Xi Jinping was giving out. The second thing that I found interesting was that much of it, and I'm not just talking about the bilateral summit with Prime Minister Modi, but also the SCO summit, as well as the military parade which was held on 3rd of September. That was yesterday, in which President Putin and North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un were present. You would have
Hmm.
noticed that most of the state of the art weaponry that was prominently displayed during their military parade, you must have
Hmm.
noticed that the letterheads were all written in English, right?
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
did this strike you that China, which obviously the English is not as prevalent in China as it is in India, and most of the Chinese
Correct.
don't even know English. So what were they trying to do? So the very clearly that military parade was meant for the West to see. China was giving out a signal to the West that look, we do not need. I mean, we are a country which nobody can stop from rising. We do not fear the United States, and we can give it back to the United States. And even though you have tried to contain us, look, I have President Putin on my side, Kim Jong Un, and all other world leaders except the Europe with us. The global South is with me, so you cannot contain me. This was the message which Beijing was trying to send. And I think that Prime Minister Modi's bilateral summit was also part of that message, in the sense that he was telling the US that this is a person or this is a country whom you value, you have a strategic partnership with, but now the Prime Minister has come and met me in a bilateral. So,
Yeah.
I am, yeah, I'm putting one over you. This is the perspective
Hmm.
from that. I was talking about the Chinese perspective. Now, let us come to India. What was India trying to do? And I've written this in my piece that for India, it was difficult. The fact that India was trying two things at the same time. India does not want the relationship with United States to be destroyed and damaged. It is doing all it can to contain the damage. But obviously, the Prime Minister runs a democracy, and he is ultimately accountable to the people. And the way the Indians have been treated, the insults and the abuses that have come from the United States, led by the president and his team, and the tariff, of course, that has destroyed Indian businesses in the southern part of the country, that has made the Indians very angry. So
Hmm.
Prime Minister Modi has a very difficult job. He obviously does not want the relationship with the United States to be crashed and burnt, because India and the United States share a close strategic partnership. There's a lot of investments. Many US companies are invested in India. We need
Mhm.
technology from them. We need investment from them. So it is not in our interest to crash and burn this relationship. That said, we cannot be seen to be bending before a US president who's using intemperate language, abuses, and is imposing tariffs on us. We are a sovereign nation. Our trade policy and our foreign policy will be set in New Delhi. It will not be set in Washington D.C. You cannot tell us whom we will buy our oil from. It is up to
Mhm.
us. We have 1.4 billion people. Their energy security is of paramount importance to us. You cannot tell us that you do not buy from here and you do not buy from here. That is for me to decide. I
And
am
you
not.
also, Srimo, even the way Trump has been cozying up to Pakistani's military dictatorship, I think it's rich for the Americans to kind of then turn around and say that, oh, look at this gathering of strong men and dictators. I mean,
I
who do
was
you
I
think
was going to
Asi
come to
Munir
that.
is?
I
Yeah.
was going to come to that in part of what I assume to be the Indian response. So I was saying that one of the reasons which India has expressed its strategic independence is that the reason is that New Delhi wants Washington DC to understand that we are not being necessarily antagonistic to you, but we are expressing our independence, our strategic autonomy. And if the
Hmm.
US mistakes that for defiance, that's US's problem. That's not our problem. That is for the American side to understand. But we will do what is necessary for us. We have not
Hmm.
broken in rules. We have purchased the Russian oil in accordance with the G7 price cap. We are not going to break any rules, but you cannot tell us to stop doing this or stop doing that. So it was important for India to send a message to the US that while you are pressurizing us, while you think that you can bring us back to the table and offer us, and force us into very extractive terms, that is not going to help. We have options. So part of what was happening when Prime Minister Modi went to Beijing was telling the United States that India cannot be cornered and it cannot be forced into doing something that it does not want to do. It has options. It will diversify its market, and it will have options. That is one of the reasons. The second reason, of course, as I
Quick
said,
question. Quick
yeah,
question, Srimoy. When we started out, I spoke about the trade deficit between India and China, and we have a trade surplus trade deficit of $99.2 billion with them. How open are the Chinese going to be? How much are they going to open their markets, rather, to Indian goods and services?
that's a very important question, actually. If you look at the readouts of both sides released after the Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping's bilateral summit, you would notice that the Indian side has referred to this trade deficit, and it has mentioned the fact that the trade deficit will be, and this was also elaborated upon by the Foreign Secretary in his press briefing right after the bilateral summit, that the trade deficit will be ultimately resolved in line with the political and the strategic trajectory of ties. This is this is difficult for India because we cannot, and one of the reasons why this rapprochement happened from the Indian side was that India understands that unless it is it opens its some of its sectors to Chinese investment, it is going to incur heavy losses. In fact, there has been a lot of pressure from the business side, and I've got the figures here. I think the Indian businesses have lost billions and around $15 billion worth of, and there have been 100,000 loss of employment due to the fact that the Chinese have been shut out
Hmm.
after the Galwan incident. So there was a lot
Hmm.
of pressure from the business side also to open up certain sectors of Indian economy for Chinese investments. So the one of the things that people do not understand is that the trade deficit is it's not as if India can tomorrow decouple itself from China and completely tell China that unless you fix the trade deficit, we are not going to do trade with you. That is not in
Right.
India's interest, because in many sectors Chinese investment is needed for India's economy to rise because of because of the let's say the um, because of the way the Chinese have handled the supply chain, the way they dominate the supply chain, you would have noticed that even the Americans had to draw back after initially imposing tariffs on them because the Chinese have a monopoly on the critical rare earths and minerals. So the
Mhm.
way the Chinese have developed their dominance over the supply chain, it is very difficult for a country to stop doing business with them, because it will also end up harming India's own interests. So
Correct.
India obviously wants to restore some sort of a
Lessen the gap.
parity. Yes,
Lessen
lessen
the
the
gap.
gap. But India's point is that that gap will become progressively lessened as and when the relationship eases and there is more investment from the Chinese side. Because if the Chinese set up factories in India and make for the world, that will in turn allow India's economy to grow, and that will once again in turn allow some of that gap to lessen. So it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be day after tomorrow. It will take a little bit more time than that.
But
But that has to be
Srimoy,
the
Srimoy, it's also dependent on how stable and friendly our relationships remain, because
so
we have had a past that has been ridden with conflict.
So there is a contradiction in India's approach, and that contradiction came through in the readout, which I have written about recently. The contradiction is this: if you notice that the Prime Minister, during his initial interaction with the Chinese President, laid down very clearly that if there is peace and tranquility in the border areas, then the relationship will restore. It will be restored to normalcy. But if the region remains unstable, then the relationship will be affected. This has been India's stated position,
Hmm.
and the Prime Minister repeated this as well. However, in the readout, there is also a mention, and this line stood out to me when I was reading it, that the normalcy in ties will now also depend on the political direction of bilateral ties and the strategic trajectory of bilateral ties. This is a
What does that
strategic
mean?
conception. It
What does
basically
that
means
mean? Break it down for us.
this is a strategic conception close to Beijing's heart. According to Beijing, the relationship of the border, the relationship between India and China, let's say the issue of trade or the issue of the boundary, that should not define the overall relationship. If the overall relationship is good, if the overall relationship is going well, then we'll be able to solve those problems better. But if you are going to tell me that you are not going to normalize your relationship with me unless I fix the border issue, if you are telling me that I'm not going to fix the overall relationship unless I fix the trade imbalance, then this relationship will not improve. This is China's line. India's line has always been that boundary issue has to be fixed for normalcy to return in ties. There is a complete daylight
Mm-hmm.
between these two stands. My point is that I have seen and I noticed this for the very first time in this readout, and I think the Indian side has conceded a bit of strategic pace to China in this meeting. And I have mentioned that in my line because the Indian side came out with a very specific line saying that the political direction will also eventually decide on the way the boundary is solved. Because there was a question which was asked to the foreign secretary, and I think that question was asked by the correspondent at Indian Express about how can we talk about uh, you know, India and China are development partners and not rivals when there are so many troops standing against each other at the border. How do you square this? So
Mm-hmm.
to answer that, the foreign secretary said that the overall trajectory of ties is what is important. The overall trajectory has been set by the two leaders that we are partners and not rivals. Now, in accordance with that, now the rest of the problems will be fixed. This is a very Chinese perspective, and I think in my understanding, we have given a bit of strategic space. We have considered a bit of strategic space, which is why the last piece that I wrote had a headline that China emerges as the winner, but India won't be displeased. I think that there has been a concession from India on this side, but
Is it a concession, Shima? Is it a concession or is it pragmatism? Because the situation that we find ourselves in with the tariffs coming down on us, there are questions of livelihoods, of all of those necessities that need to keep us on the growth trajectory, because we cannot deviate from that path, and anything that makes us deviate from that path has to be tackled. So the prime minister is thinking 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, and saying, okay, this is a bump in the road. We give a little, but we keep on our path. I think maybe
no,
India has brought a little bit
I
of that
don't, I
pragmatism.
don't, I don't necessarily disagree. It's a way of looking at it. Obviously, the line that I used in my piece was that the the souring of relationship with the US has constricted India's space for maneuvering. At the end of the day, that is what it is. India has to choose the most pragmatic path for its rise, and if that means that it has to do tactical understandings, it will do it. We are talking about a prime minister who was slapped with a visa ban at one time by the US, and he took
Right.
India to be one of the closest strategic partners of the US. So the prime minister thinks in terms of national interest. He is not bothered about his personal
And
interests.
long
So
term,
that
and long term.
exactly
Yeah, he
long
has a
term.
plan.
So
He has a plan.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that always shines through. So it's a way of looking at it. I would say that this is pragmatism. This tactical concession was necessary, but it is, my interpretation is that it is a tactical concession, because this was clearly a Beijing's line, that if you look at the overall relationship, that we are not rivals and we are partners, then we can solve those little problems that you keep talking about, the boundary, the trade. And another thing
Mm,
about trade that I wanted to underline is that for India to become a China plus one member of the global supply chain network, it actually needs Chinese help, because of the
mm.
way the Chinese have kind of entrenched themselves in the global supply chain network. You cannot cut off China and become economically prosperous. That is not possible. No country in the world can do that. None, absolutely zero. And in fact, this is one of the lessons which China learned from the USSR. The
Mm,
Chinese leaders, the Chinese Communist Party leaders, they obsess over USSR. Their obsession was, how did a communist regime fail? And and, and Xi Jinping and all the brains behind Xi Jinping who advise him, they are obsessed with this question, that how did the USSR regime fail? And one of the lessons that they understood from the fall of USSR is that the USSR almost siloed itself off from the global economy. That they do not want
mm.
to do. So they have entrenched themselves in global economy in such a way that you cannot cut them off and survive, which is why the US has to come to the table. Trump is, first imposed the tariffs. Now he is giving suspension of the tariffs. Three times he has suspended these tariffs, and he might extend it as well.
See, that brings me to Trump. And before I come to Trump, I want to really talk about even the terrorism aspect. We know China shares a good working relationship with the Pakistanis, although one has to say the Pakistanis were not given any special treatment during the SCO summit. In fact, they were quite marginal in the proceedings. So there's obviously been a shift in that relationship too. I don't think China is really that viewing Pakistan's growing closeness with the US that generously, considering they've been a good friend to them during times when the US was turned away from Pakistan and saw it as the source of all evil, and Osama bin Laden living it up there. So that's one aspect. But coming back to Trump is so unreliable, Srimoy. 2 months from now, he may suspend the tariffs on India. He just needs an out wherein he can do it with a little bit of pomp and a little bit of arrogance. He'll do it. What happens to the China India equation then?
As I said, the China-India equation has its own logic. It is driven by its own strategic and economic logic, and it is not dependent on a third party. In fact, if you look at the Indian readout very closely, there is a line mentioned by India which says that the China-India relationship should not be seen from the third lens. That is actually directed at Xi Jinping, because the Chinese have a history of interpreting its relationship with India in context of India's relationship with the US, which is why
Right.
you notice, and I said this at the very beginning, that China appears very pleased that there has been a jhamela between India and the US. That is making them happy. So India is saying that, look, there's no point, and whatever happens between US and us, it's between US and us. Our relationship is independent of it. This is India's position. So I don't think that Trump taking tariff away or imposing more tariffs on us is going to make a difference to how India sees China. That is number one. Number two is that with Trump, no one knows what will happen. Yesterday, I saw him speaking to a reporter saying that he has imposed sanctions on India. This is the first time the US president has used the word sanctions in place of tariffs, right? And the word sanctions has got a huge history in India
Connotation.
US relationship. It's a
Yeah.
it's a taboo
Yeah.
word. So he's used that word, and not only that, he said, I have not even gone to phase 2 and phase 3. Now,
Oh.
no one knows. He has not clarified it. but it is possible, just by taking those words out of context, it is possible to theorize that maybe Trump might increase the tariffs even higher on India, or we don't know what he will do. He's very unpredictable. And the thing about Trump is that in this entire White House, regardless of the fact that there is a Treasury Secretary, there is a Secretary of State, there is a Defense Secretary, these people mean nothing. There is only one person in this White House, that is Trump. Whatever he decides is policy. The rest are there just to justify it. Their
Mm,
actions
mm.
mean nothing. Which is why, for instance, when the relationship with India is going south, somebody like Marco Rubio, who's actually a very knowledgeable guy, and he
And he's
knows what
pro India. And
he's
he's
pro
pro
India,
India.
knowledgeable guy. Unfortunately, the insiders in Washington tell me that he has been remarkably quiet because he's been pushed to the sidelines. His voice
Mm,
is no longer heard. So
mm,
the sad thing is that in this White House, there is only one person who matters, and that's Trump himself. That is actually both
mm,
an opportunity and a threat. Why am I saying this? Because look at Pakistan. Because of the fact that only Trump matters and none else matters, it has capitalized on that opportunity and it has grown closer to the US. But we are facing the brunt once again for the same reason, because there is only one person who makes all the decisions. We
mm,
cannot be Pakistan, so this is inevitable. But
mm,
this is what it is. And in fact, according to the former United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the fact that Pakistan started crypto investment in Trump's business interests and his family is one of the main reasons why Trump has drawn closer to Pakistan and gone anti-India. So this is unbelievable. A US president, his own business interest is being put ahead of the interest of the country. This is the reality.
yeah. And it's really tragic, actually, but so be it. I also want to, speaking of politics, and this is really the final question because you have to also leave in about 4 minutes. We decided to do a short one
Yeah.
today. Very quickly, can you tell? There have been these rumors about she actually not being on very steady ground in China amongst the Politburo. So, can you give a little primer on what is his political standing in China right now, and how much was this victory parade and all of this, and this international soiree meant to signal to the Chinese people also that I'm very much in control and I'm here to stay?
So I'm not a scholar of Chinese elite politics. So I can only give you my impression from what I see from the outside. And from the reports that I see, Xi Jinping is in complete control of Chinese Communist Party. There is no threat to his authority. And
Okay.
in fact, in the last few months, he has purged almost all leaders, military leaders from the Central Military Commission, people who are and some of them have been handpicked by Xi himself. So, unless
Mm,
a person is in complete command of the command chain, this was not possible. There have been some speculation about a factionalism within the CPC. The fact that Chinese Communist Party is a very opaque organization, those sort of rumors can always be possible and plausible, right? Because we don't know what is going on inside. If someone says that they know, they actually don't, because it's a very opaque organization. But you can pick up signals. The signal is this,
mm,
that Xi Jinping is in complete command. There is no, at least from what I can see, there is no threat to his authority. And what the military parade showed to the rest of the world, that China, despite the containment strategies of the United States, China does not, it is sending the signal that nobody can contain China's rise. And this was pretty much the main thrust of Xi Jinping's speech during the military parade,
mm,
that the rise of the Chinese nation is inevitable. Nobody can stop that. And also the fact that, Taiwan will one day be connected with the mainland, that is also inevitable. And Xi Jinping also understands that in Donald Trump, he's got a very distracted US president who does not
mm,
follow a set policy. In fact, for China, a Biden administration, despite an octogenarian Biden not in control of his own mental equity, but still, the fact that that administration followed a policy was a bigger threat than Trump, who one day says one thing and the next day complete another. So it is easier for the Chinese to handle him, and the Chinese know that, and they know how
yeah.
to press certain buttons. So I would say that if I were Xi Jinping, I'd be in a very comfortable position right now.
Okay, and on that note, I think it's fair to say that China is very astute. They're very inscrutable. They've sensed the American decline on the global stage, and they've also sensed the Indian rise on the global stage, and have realized that let's tackle America first and let's be friendly with India for now. I think that's really where we're at, to be completely honest. And it works for us at this present time. So we should just go with that, I guess. But thank you so much, Sreemoy. I know you're very busy, and I want you to come back again. I think these are such
Sure,
interesting conversations because
absolutely.
there's so much noise and there's so many headlines. And I have a relative in Germany right now, and the front page newspaper is that image of Modi, Xi, and Putin. This wouldn't have happened earlier, but it just goes to tell you how things are changing right in front of our eyes.
Yeah,
Unthinkable situations
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
friendships and alliances are emerging. So, very exciting time. Thank you so much for joining me. And I want to thank
Thank
all
you.
our viewers also for coming in on a Thursday evening. And I'm going to try and do more of these one on ones with informed guests so that we get some real perspective. And Sunil suggested I do more monologues. So, I'm going to try and do that as well. And I want to thank you all for joining us and for subscribing to the channel. Please go ahead and subscribe if you haven't as yet. And of course, like and share the video if you found it interesting. And we will be back soon. Thank you and
Thank
bye
you.
for now.
Thank you. Bye.